Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
This is Paul Tice, the author of The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. And you're listening to the Dr. Sky Experience on Talk Radio 77 on WABC.
And ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Dr. Sky Experience. Here on Talk Radio 77 WABC, as we call it, the crown jewel of radio, the iconic 77 Talk Radio WABC, beaming out of New York City, the nation, the world, and I'm sure the cosmos. The Dr. Sky Experience normally goes to the subjects of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather, but also jam-packed in our program. And here on this particular radio station, stories of American exceptionalism. And today, a very special guest. We'll be speaking in just a moment with author Paul Tice. He's the author of a brand new book entitled The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. But before we introduce our guest, a little bit of background not only on our guest, also about the subject at hand, which I'm sure each and every one will find fascinating. Paul Tice spent 40 years working on Wall Street and is the author of the new book, The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. He worked at some of the industry's most recognizable firms, including J.P. Morgan Chase, Lehman Brothers, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, and BlackRock. And for most of his career, he specialized in the energy sector, both as a top-ranked sell-side research analyst and a buy-side investment manager, which has made him an expert in climate policy and environmental regulation, as well as its financial offshoot, the ESG and sustainable investment movement. In recent years, he has taught as an adjunct professor of finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. So what's the book about? Over the past few years, so-called sustainable investing, new practice based on the theory that environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, to make it simple, factors should drive corporate policy and investment decisions, has now swept across Wall Street. And with that, let's welcome our special guest, author Paul Tice, The Race to Zero. Paul, thank you for joining us on the Dr. Sky Experience here on WABC. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, my pleasure. And it's always interesting. And to the listeners of this particular show, we want to mention, too, we talk about American exceptionalism. And what's more important, ladies and gentlemen, than talking about the future of America and what's our financial strength, or there is the lack of it. And many of you out there who are obviously serious about the investment world out there, this, in my opinion, is a must-read book. So talk to us about this, Paul. Why did you write the book itself? I mean, it's so exciting to listen to somebody who not only has financial expertise, but as we get into the climate story, that also.
Well, I wrote the book because even though over the last 2 or 3 years there's been more pushback on ESG, you haven't heard anyone who's worked in the industry or on Wall Street offer a critical view of what's going on with sustainability. So I thought it was important to kind of give an insider's view and what the industry really thinks about it. And I do think the view expressed in the book speaks to a silent majority on Wall Street. The problem with ESG, which we'll get into, is that it's a very coercive system. And so it's very difficult for individuals to speak out about it. And that was something that I experienced, towards the tail end of my career. So I thought it was important to actually articulate that.
No, you do it very well. And here's an interesting sideline. I wanted to ask you, talk about how woke capitalism and this whole ESG concept came about. Give us a timeline on this, because I'm not a serious financial investor, but every penny I have, I make sure it goes to the right direction. And I do it, of course, as best as possible, being no expert. But talk with us a little bit about this whole phenomenon here that you talk about in the book and movement ESG, how long has this been prevalent in the financial markets? How far back does it go is what I'm asking.
Well, I mean, if you just went by the headlines, you would think that this was a fad that came out of nowhere, really, over the last 10 years, particularly since 2015. But the important point is this is not a populist movement that somehow just sprang on us and that we discovered in the last few years. You can actually trace the roots of ESG investing at least all the way back to the 80s, when climate change and sustainable development were started up by the United Nations. And ESG investing is really the third leg of the stool, and it's also the United Nations that's leading the charge there. So they're all three intertwined. But as I discuss in the book, you can really take ESG and go back really the last 200 years and see it kind of on a continuum of challenges to capitalism, really going back to the 19th century. So this is just the latest attack on capitalism, and it's probably the most threatening of them to date because with ESG, it's focused on climate change and fossil fuels. And if you can negate fossil fuels, then that is a very effective attack on capitalism because it's really fossil fuels that has driven economic growth and the capitalist system for the last 200 years. So I think we need to acknowledge, first off, this is a very long game that the other side has been playing, and they've got a significant head start on us if we want to reverse it.
Interesting. Let's talk about legacy media for a moment here. How long, in your opinion, has this been suppressed? And obviously, as we end the interview in a while, and certainly we'll actually have many questions answered by you, but my interest in this is also being part of the media. How, in your opinion, has this been suppressed, or is this something that they're just ignoring without suppressing? And obviously, you bring to the table so many ideas here to wake people up. How long has this basically been hidden by the media, or what's the story behind that?
Well, it's interesting. It's hiding in plain sight, I would say, because even though it's basically an investment scam, it's out in the public view, and it's a very comprehensive system. But again, if you can basically suppress any sort of dissent by people within the industry, by people within business running companies, then there's not a lot of opposition that the media needs to focus on. So I think the media is obviously supportive of the progressive agenda that's embedded in ESG. So they are all of like mind, but it's not like there are a lot of opposing views that have been offered up until now. And I think that one of the main reasons for that is because ESG is all about climate change, you need to get into an immediate public fight about climate data and science and whether it's actually a real problem. And a lot of people are not willing to do that because they're afraid of being called a climate denier.
Wow. Powerful stuff here. Our special guest, of course, today, Paul Tice, the author of this great book, ladies and gentlemen. If you're interested in where your money goes and where the direction of the markets go, why not get a copy from Encounter Books, The Race to Zero, subtitled, backtitled, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. And he's with us here on Talk Radio 77 WABC. I'm Steve Cates, Dr. Sky, with the Dr. Sky Experience. And ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a little backstory about history here, many quotes are in this book, and if I can take the liberty, Paul, of going through one of these, very well written. Vladimir Lenin, I'm thinking of Putin today, but Vladimir Lenin said it, and I quote, "The best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency," end quote. Interesting. And you also have here another quote from the great P.T. Barnum. Here it is, quote, "The bigger the humbug, the better the people will like it," end quote. You bring up all these subjects, and I'm a man of science. I mean, studying astronomy and space, and that's my background through school. But what I wanted to ask you is, I've studied so much about the whole climate change story, and I couldn't agree more about this concept that I think we're being stroked in a bad way here. That there's still, as I talk to people, and not to get away from your book here, but I tell people from the astronomical side that all weather comes from the sun, and there's been many, many cycles throughout history, sunspots, changes, volcanism on the Earth. But more important than what I have to say about this, that's why I'm a climate change skeptic on this. Talk about your research in this and how you bring both of these together. What's your general view of this whole climate change concept?
Yeah, I devote actually chapter 2 of the book goes through it. I basically approach it from a layman's perspective or as an investment analyst, because I think anyone really in the American public can have a view on climate change. This is not something that needs to be ceded to the so-called experts, many of which are conflicted, I think, in terms of, who is paying for a lot of their research. So I go through in Chapter 2 all of the basic fatal flaws in the argument, starting with the bad data, the fact that we don't have historical data that's consistent, the fact that the climate models are taking that bad data and then projecting it forward. The models never actually predict what they say they are, so they're missing in real time. And, the whole craziness around this whole argument is that, Wall Street is being forced to, take the climate argument at face value and what the models are spitting out over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But Wall Street never really looks at a financial model much longer than 1 or 2 years down the road, because they're always faulty, right? So it's an interesting Jedi mind trick that the climate movement is trying to push onto Wall Street. But it's been effective up until now because, again, no one wants to throw that first punch and get into that argument. But if you go through it and the other side doesn't make it easy for you getting your hands on the data that's objective, but you can see all the basic problems in the argument. And, if there is not a climate crisis, and there is no consensus about that.
Absolutely.
And if CO2 is not driving temperature, but the reverse is true, which many believe based on the paleoclimate data, if temperature drives CO2, then there is no problem, which means that all of the trillions of dollars we've spent for the last several decades have been a waste of money.
I couldn't agree more.
We can stop this whole ESG, because without climate change, ESG will just blow away.
Right. So it's more like, to me, and I don't want to sound like an alarmist or a conspiratorial guy, but it's all about this global governance. And I want your opinion on this. If we're supposed to hook, line, and sinker, just believe every single thing that's coming and spouting out of government agencies here in America and other places around the world, I think Albert Einstein said it better. Another great quote that you have in the book: unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth, end quote. How well is that said? But more important to the point here, this whole thing of global governance, if you take a look at China, I want to get your perspective on this, and hopefully I'm correct on this. We're told to do all these global, in the U.S., all this control of carbon emissions. But what's China doing? The People's Republic of China, constantly building in violation of any kind of common sense if this world is to get along. They're building more coal-fired plants all the time. Thus, they're not even part of cooperating in any way. So how could this be something that we really have to be so concerned about and, sell our children off to this insanity? I mean, you got the floor, sir. So to talk more about this, it excites me when I hear things like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the other, there are many amazing aspects to the argument, but if you look at both climate change, sustainable development, and ESG investing, it's a two-tiered system for all three. There's a different standard that's held out for the developed world, mainly North America and Europe. And then the third world, which includes China and India, which is, up for debate, they are held to a completely lower standard. So it's meant to basically deindustrialize the developed world and allow the developing world to catch up, which obviously is going to lead to, lower income levels in the developed world, higher poverty rates, higher mortality rates. But it's a two-tiered system, and no one talks about that, particularly when it comes to the financial markets. And to your point about, one world government, because of the targeting of fossil fuels and creating carbon emissions as a pollution problem, that will allow the elites and the third parties pushing this on the markets to basically control everyone's economic freedom, because fossil fuels drive economic growth, individual mobility. So they'll be able to control everyone's lives simply by going after fossil fuels, which makes it, again, the biggest threat, I think, to capitalism to come along up until now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's horrible, and people are, asleep at the switch on this. That's why we have guests like yourself. Again, if you're just joining us here on the Dr. Sky Experience, another great guest. His name is Paul Tice, and his brand new book, I encounter books, The Race to Zero, backstory and back title, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. He's with us here as we talk here on WABC, Talk Radio 77, out of New York, around the nation, and around the world. But this is interesting. I mean, are you at liberty to name some of the companies that are at the big lead on this? I mean, is that something without, violating any kind of secrecies or anything like that? I mean, who is the average person out there listening would say, ask Paul, what are some of the corporations that are trying to lead this charge on Wall Street and the financial sector? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I think I want to make a distinction between true believers and those, public CEOs that are afraid. And there's a mix of both, running companies on Wall Street as well as in the business world. So for every firm, like say a BlackRock, where Larry Fink has clearly been out as a leader of this policy and leading the charge when it comes to ESG and sustainability. I know there's been a tactical retreat recently, but clearly he's been one of the bigger and more vocal supporters. For every one of the Larry Finks out there are many more CEOs who are afraid to speak out against this. Again, because of the coercive nature and the way the ESG system works, if you speak out, you become the next target. You have to worry about a protest at your headquarters or at your next annual meeting or a proxy fight when it comes up for the next spring season and potentially losing the trust of your board. So with ESG, it's all about engaging with companies, but there's an escalation process if the companies don't go along. So it's something to keep in mind. So rather than focusing on those that are true believers, we need to figure out something that will take the pressure off the entire system, because there are many more leaders out there who just don't have enough backbone to speak up. And if you look at the energy sector, that shows you how effective the ESG movement is, because I think we can all agree fossil fuels is the primary target of ESG, and you still don't have a lot of energy CEOs speaking out and defending themselves.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. I mean, you've brought it to the table here, some great revelations here. You would imagine that the big corporate, executives at these, fossil fuel type corporations, we all know the names. If I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying they're kind of behind the door on this and they're not really jumping up and screaming bloody murder. I mean, they need to get more involved in this. But again, the reason that you talk about it is what? It will put them in a bad spotlight. And why should they even be afraid of these protests? I mean, to me, that's both ludicrous. I mean, you have a lot of young people that have really, how do I say this with respect to all people involved? A lot of these protesters really have no clue on the issues, but they're just so loud and vocal, and sometimes, sadly, bringing violence to the table. I mean, 40 years ago, this nonsense would never have been tolerated. To me, it's very, very unnerving. It's very bad. Yeah,
I mean, it just shows you that, it doesn't take a lot of pressure, I think, to get people to stay in line. And we kind of learned that, living through COVID over the last few years. But with the energy industry, I think the problem there is a lot of these companies think that they'll be the last company to survive or be allowed to continue operating, post 2050. And I think that's naive. If you listen to the other side and the more extreme voices, which are telling you where the movement's going, clearly there's no room for any fossil fuels, even if we can figure out how to sequester carbon, which I don't think we'll ever be able to do that economically. So I think the energy companies are being naive, and they're probably being somewhat cynical, thinking this will blow over. But it won't blow over, because there are way too many people who have made a career and a lifetime and are making too much money on the other side of the argument. So I think that's something that we need to acknowledge and then start speaking out. In the book, I argue if the energy sector, which again is the primary target, can get a little more backbone and start speaking out more aggressively, I think that will help everyone, because there's safety in numbers. So you may get more politicians on board, and I've heard this directly talking to people at the state level. If the energy sector would defend themselves more, it would be easier for Republicans to also help.
Yeah, interesting. You bring up a good point, but I got this question globally. If they're trying to crater the U.S., fossil fuel corporations, let's take Saudi Arabia, let's talk Russia. I mean, they're not going to be affected in this in any way, shape, or form, right? In other words, if you created the American fossil fuel industries, oil and gas, doesn't that give them a very big unfair advantage in the world? Because that's only going to turn dollars back over to them. They're not part of ESG. Am I correct in this, or even thinking about that? What, Saudi and Russia? Talk about that. How does that affect the whole concept?
Yeah. If you look outside of Europe and North America, it's basically lip service that's being paid to the ESG agenda, and the same for the climate change agenda. So I don't think national oil companies, including the Saudis, are ever going to do anything to meaningfully address their emissions, because again, they're the lifeblood for a lot of these economies. They're dependent on energy. Would they be happy if the U.S. sector shut down? Sure, and we can see that from the last 10 years when we've had two, battles for market share with the Saudis as well as Russia. So they would like nothing better than for the energy sector in Europe and here to shut down.
Of course, absolutely.
But I would say this though: if we can create a ESG free space in the U.S., just the U.S. market, financial markets as well as the economy, that will derail the entire global push around climate change and ESG, because it's a prisoner's dilemma, at least with regard to the industrialized world. So if we can basically opt out, like we started to do under Trump, then that will derail the entire system, because everyone has to play along and subjugate their own economy. Otherwise, no one's going to do it.
Well, here we go. I'll shift gears a little bit with you, if you don't mind here. This is not necessarily about the book, but from the financial world. It's very rare that we get somebody with this experience here on the Dr. Sky Experience. We appreciate it. But here we go. We talk about Jerome Powell, the potentiality of lowering interest rates because people are beaten up with the high mortgage rates, the percentiles, things like that. Inflation, I understand what Paul is ticking back up. What? Because of the price of oil, I guess. That's also another factor, the price of food. When do you think, simply, my question would be this, when do you simply think that Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, will start to lower interest rates? And what do you see in that crystal ball? That's interesting.
Well, I would say I think the U.S. economy is not in great shape, despite what some of the headline numbers might indicate. As you said, inflation is still not solved. And if you look over the last 2+ years, prices are up close to 20%, right? And energy and food in particular. And I will say going forward, energy may be, again, another contributor to even more inflation, because we're already in the low 80s right now. And for whatever reason, the Biden administration announced this week that they're planning on refilling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which if they follow through on, between now and the election, is going to imply higher gasoline prices. So that will feed into inflation. And then if they follow through on some of these climate policies during their second term, then I think the inflation will go to a whole new level, because it'll be more aggressively going after energy supply, and that'll obviously feed into the price of everything. So my personal opinion is maybe, towards the back end of this year, they can start talking about interest rate cuts. But again, I think the economy's not in great shape. The consumer is very levered at this point in time. If you look at credit card balances, obviously the housing market is dealing with higher mortgage rates. So, I mean, there are problems. And the employment numbers, I think people are working 2 jobs. A lot of the jobs that we've been adding have been either government jobs or low-paying retail. So, I think the economy is not in great shape.
Well, it's interesting to have people like yourself. But now on the positive side, what can the average citizen do to counter this ESG investing without giving away the secret sauce in your book? What are some tips? Because I'm sure people are listening here and they're taking notes, or they're just happy to hear another alternative from what the legacy media just keeps promoting. And we're here to tell what we consider to be the truth with best guess. Well, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think individuals can do a lot. First off, don't patronize companies that you think are woke, or you're not comfortable with some of their public statements around certain issues. So take your money elsewhere, in the Bud Light or the Target example, or Disney. And the same goes for your investment manager. If you're not happy with, the person running that firm, whether he's saying things under duress or because he truly believes it, then take your money elsewhere. And you've seen some of the red state pension funds start to do that. So that's first and foremost. But whether you're invested in the market or not, I think Americans need to be more focused on the climate change issue and how the financial markets now are being used to defund oil and gas companies. Because, again, that's going to be a very effective way to squeeze the industry for capital and to stop it from growing. So educating yourself a little more about the basics and why climate change is kind of a scam. I think intuitively most Americans know that, but just educate yourself a little more just so you're comfortable about talking about it more in public, and then take that knowledge and start to pressure your lawmakers, because if we're going to reverse the regulatory complex that has developed around ESG and climate, it's going to take government resources, and we're going to need Republicans, particularly at the state level, to lead that charge. And they've already started to do that. So, but it will take government resources.
Your crystal ball, one more time. I mean, you're not in the political side of this equation. You have an identified party, but again, I kind of get the message here, more of a conservative thinker. And I like that, as we do here on this part when we talk about American exceptionalism. What do you think is going to happen in November of this year with the same two candidates that we had in the last election? What's your opinion on who might win this and how close or whatever? And tell us. Before
I answer that, let me just say about ESG. It is basically progressive politics masquerading as finance. So people should not shy away from debating it and criticizing it because the other side is saying you're being political. So that's first and foremost. So when I say lawmakers, I mean Republicans, only because all the Democrats uniformly support this agenda. So I think that's an important point. This fall, I would think with all the problems I cited in the U.S. economy over the last few years, and then throw in the border and throw in, 2 wars that the U.S. is getting engaged on and spending a lot of money on, things are worse off now than they were 4 years ago. And that usually meant that there's time for a change. So I would assume that, if there aren't any disruptions like we saw back in 2020, with how votes were counted and tallied, there should be turnover and Trump should be the winner. Again, it all begs the question whether we're going to have, a normal electoral process this fall. Well, let's hope so. But like I say, it's still a little early, but yet again, it's not, Paul. I appreciate your time here on this particular radio show and this archive, as we call it, the Dr. Sky Experience with me, Steve Cates, Dr. Sky. Proud to be a part of a radio station that's well over 102 years of age. Talk Radio 77 WABC, the crown jewel of radio. We like to call it the iconic 77 Talk Radio WABC. We're beaming out of New York City, the nation, the world, and the cosmos. Well, thank you so much. Once again, his book, ladies and gentlemen, that we recommend you getting from Encounter Books, The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. Paul, if you're kind enough to stay here on the line as we go to the hard break at the bottom of the hour, I do appreciate that. And to all the people listening out there, if you have questions or comments about this interview and you'd like to send them to me, my email personally is just drsky, Dr. Sky Show, DRSKY Show, @gmail.com. Paul Tice, health and happiness to you and your family, and thank you for writing this book. Now, please stay with us as we go to the bottom of the hour. Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me.